Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's session, exciting session, Space Explorers, part of the 10th York Festival of Ideas, the most brilliant idea that the University of York has ever had. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jonathan Cowop. I work for BBC Radio York, and I'm fascinated by everything to do with space, as I'm sure you are, because you're joining this seminar, this webinar with Libby Jackson this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. I'd be fascinated to know if people are joining this session of Space Explorers from outside the UK. In the UK, it's currently 4:02 in the afternoon. Now, if you are somewhere else in the world, and obviously the fact this is a webinar, an online session, means that people can join from all over the planet. So if you are elsewhere, then please use the chat function to tell us whereabouts you are if you're outside the UK. If you're in the UK and you were watching the 10 o'clock news last night, you'll have seen a fascinating piece on the news about Jeff Bezos and his intention to go into space on board Blue Origin with his brother in a month or so's time. As part of that report on the BBC 10 o'clock news last night, you will, I hope, have seen our special guest speaker this afternoon, Libby Jackson. And you may even, as I did, point at the television screen and go, she's the person we're hearing from tomorrow. This is an unrivaled opportunity to hear from somebody extremely special, somebody with credentials like very few other people in the UK have. She's worked for the European Space Agency, for NASA, and for the UK Space Agency. And Libby's book is also out at the moment with 25 questions you might want to ask about going into space. Let's hope we deal with many, many more questions than that this afternoon. In order to do that, I will shut up and say, please welcome our speaker this afternoon, Libby Jackson. Good afternoon, Libby.
Thank you so much for that fabulous introduction. And a huge thanks to the University of York and the York Festival Ideas for having me along today. It's delightful. I'm delighted to be here and to be able to talk to you and share the tales from my book. And now let's make sure that you can see this. There we go. I hope very much that you can see that. So yeah, I'm here today to talk about my book, Space Explorers, and to share some of the fantastic stories from it. Why have I written this book? How did I get there? I want to take you back, first of all, just to me. And this was me, when I was a little girl, because space has been something I have been interested in my whole life. Human spaceflight in particular has been really just something that captured my imagination. When I was young, I would look out at the stars. I would try and spot shooting stars as they went past. I would devour all the stories of the Apollo moon landings, of the first early days of astronauts getting into space. Now, I'm not old enough to remember the moon landings. I was born just about the same time that the first space shuttle roared off and went into space. So that was what I grew up with, was the stories of the space shuttle and those exciting times of seeing the astronauts get to start to learn how to live and work in space. But it was all those stories of the early days that really caught my imagination and inspired me to sort of dream of space. It took me a long time to see and realize that I could have a job working in the space industry, but I did. I did that by doing things that I enjoyed doing, by studying science and maths, and that led me ultimately to work in mission control for the International Space Station, where I was a flight controller and then a flight director. Just like you see in the movies, just as much fun. I was there alongside the astronauts all the time. And today I still work alongside them. This is me with Tim Peake. I've really been involved in human spaceflight now for my whole life. And what I wanted to do in the Space Explorers book was take those stories that inspired me, that I've heard about, that I've learned about through my career, and turn them into a book to share with you, to share those stories those bits of excitement that are amazing and true, that really happened, to sort of be able to help you, the readers, get involved, find out what it's like, discover these amazing unknown stories that really truly happened. And that's what I'm going to do today, is share some of them with you. And I want to go back first of all to the thing that inspired me, really. The most famous story that I hope you all know out there, of Neil and Buzz on the moon. And the picture here in front is from the book. And I have to say already, all these fantastic illustrations were by someone called Leonard Dupont. And so I cannot take credit for any of the pictures. I also can't take credit for any of the stories because they were all true. So let's start here. The moon landings, Apollo 11, the most famous mission perhaps of all time. And this was Neil and Buzz on the moon's surface. But Apollo 11 nearly went really wrong. It could have been so different. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how those things happen, what really nearly happened. So Neil and Buzz were on their way to the moon. They'd left Michael Collins orbiting the moon, and they were in the lunar module. This is the lunar module. It was their spacecraft that was going to take them down to the surface of the moon and back up. And it's an amazing flying machine that was designed just to land people on the moon and take them back again. It wasn't ever going to work down on the surface of the Earth. And it had been flown before in space. The previous mission, the astronauts had got it nearly down to the surface of the moon, but not landed. So this was the first time anyone was going to attempt the landing. Neil and Buzz were in this spacecraft. They were flying along. They were looking out the window and they were making sure that what they could see out the window was matching where they expected to be. But the computer was flying the spacecraft for them with a really very simple computer by today's standards, far less powerful than the smartphones that you might have in your pocket. But this computer was working out where they needed to be and where they were going to go to. But Neil and Buzz were staring at the computer, making sure the numbers were all right. Neil was looking out the window, watching all the landmarks go past, looking at what was happening. And they were really concentrating. And then all of a sudden, the computer blared out this alarm, went beep, beep, beep. And on their computer displays, they just said 12:02. That was it. Now, Neil and Buzz had no idea what 12:02 meant. They were still, the computer was flying them down to the surface of the moon. They were on their way down. The whole world was watching. They had no idea what 12:02 meant. And their hearts started beating. What did it mean? Was it going to go wrong? Should they abort? Should they stop the landing? What was going on? That's where Mission Control was there to help them. But Mission Control weren't saying anything because Mission Control didn't know what was happening either. The flight director, the person who sits in that seat, like I had done, he looked to his specialist, his computer specialist, called Steve, and said, "What is it?" And Steve said, "I don't know." But Steve got on the voice loops, started talking to the people that were in another room and said, "What's going on?" And there was a person called Jack. And Jack knew that this 12:02 alarm just meant that the computer was busy and it was processing. It had like a whirly symbol that you get on computers now when it's busy and it's like, "Oh, wait." Jack knew this because he'd done all his homework, he'd done all his preparation, and it just took a little bit of time for all that discussion to happen on Earth and for the message to go all the way back to the moon, where Neil and Buzz were there, and they said, "Don't worry." Mission Control said to them, 12:02 alarm, you can keep going. So they kept going down, and then it went off again. Same thing, kept going. In all of this, as they kept going down, the alarm kept going off and it kept distracting them. Neil started to see that they were off course. They had really worked out where they should be at each step along the way as they were going down to the moon, and they were looking out for these landmarks, and the landmarks were coming up at the wrong time. They were in the wrong place, and Neil could see that this computer was going to land the lunar module into a big sea of rocks which would be really dangerous, because if that lunar module landed down on a big rocky plain and it was just slightly offside, it was going to tilt over and it was going to crash, and Neil and Buzz would be stuck on the moon and there would be no way home, and that would be the end of the mission. So Neil was a very good pilot, and he could see what was happening. So he took over control from the computer. He started flying it himself, and he controlled the lunar module, and he controlled the rate of descent of the rocket engines as it was firing, and he guided it to go over the rocky period. He could see in the distance it was a nice flat area, but the fuel was going down and down and down. It was well into the red, and in mission control everybody could see the fuel was getting less and less and less, and they had no idea what Neil and Buzz were doing. There was no way they could talk to them. They knew they were concentrating, and Neil and Buzz were way too concentrated on what was going on to tell mission control. So it was just, everybody watched, and Neil flew it down, and then finally, with 20 or so seconds of fuel left in the tank, landed on the moon. And mission control breathed. Everybody there was holding their breath, and they made it down. They made it down. They did their their moonwalk. They collected the rocks, they put the flag up, they said those famous words. They had a fantastic time. They made history. Everybody knows about it. But that wasn't the end of it. They still had to get home. And after they had landed on the moon and put their big bulky spacesuits on so they could go and walk on the moon, and they squeezed out and they walked around the moon, they squeezed back in and they bumped in, that lunar module was tiny. And after they did the moonwalk, and then they got a little bit of sleep, and then they realized it was time to go home. And as they looked to press the button that was going to fire the rocket engine to launch them off the moon and get them back into space, they saw that that button wasn't there, and without that button they couldn't go home. So this is not good. They looked around. They didn't tell mission control particularly. They found this felt tip pen, and they used a felt tip pen to shove it in the hole to make the button work. And at the right moment, that was how they managed to do this. And this is the video, not from Apollo 11, this is from 17, but then finally they made it was their felt tip pen, got it in the button, and this happened. That was how Neil and Buzz got off the moon, all thanks to a felt tip pen. And so that flight went well, and we all know about Neil and Buzz, but it was all thanks to the people in mission control. And these are the people in mission control, again from the book. You can see on the left there, that's Gene Kranz. That's the flight director. He was the one who was in charge of Apollo 11 as they were landing to the moon, and everybody was making sure that that computer was doing its okay thing. He was also in the hot seat when something else happened. So Apollo 11 we know about, but have you heard about Apollo 13? This was the mission that really was going to be the second time that everybody had landed on the moon. And a lot of people were really worried because 13 is a number that's unlucky for some people. And indeed, the crew changed just a few days before launch, because in the middle, you've got Jack Swigert. And Jack wasn't supposed to be going to the moon. It was supposed to be Ken Mattingly. But Ken got exposed to the measles just before launch. And the doctors were getting really sick the doctors were getting really worried that he might come down with the measles on the way to the moon, and that would be really bad. So just at the very last minute, Jack was swapped into the crew, and they all headed off to the moon. And they were nearly at the moon when they were getting ready. They'd done a TV broadcast. This was the scene in mission control. They just said goodnight. They were getting ready. And mission control, just before they went to bed, asked them to do one more thing. Now, on the way to when you're flying to the moon, you're in that lunar module you're in the command module, you're in the spacecraft on the way to the moon. And inside that, there are some tanks that keep all your oxygen. Because if you're going to go all the way to the moon, you've got to be able to breathe the oxygen, and those are in big tanks. And on the way to the moon, the oxygen was kept really, 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 really cold. because if you keep gas really cold, it turns into a liquid and it's easier to store it in space. So they had to stir these tanks, these oxygen tanks, to make sure that they had enough oxygen, that the liquid was kept in the right way. And they stirred the tanks. That's what mission control asked them to do. And all of a sudden, there was a giant bang. And the whole spacecraft up in space started wobbling and spinning. And, you know, there was a big shimmy. Everything was shaking. And the astronauts had no idea what was going on. Down in mission control, all they saw was all the numbers on the screen went bad. They went, oh, there's been a problem. But they didn't know what. And they couldn't see and feel the shimmying and the problem. And this was the point at which the mission went really wrong. Very famously, Jim Lovell radioed down to mission control and said, Houston, we've got a problem. And they looked at it and they looked at it and they couldn't work out what was going on. And that was when they worked out that all of the oxygen was leaking out into space. And for some reason, there had been an explosion. And here was the crew, nearly all the way to the moon, when all their oxygen just disappeared. And how were they going to get home? And it was the people in mission control who worked it all out. They worked out that they were going to have to not land on the moon. The crew were going to have to fly around the moon back to Earth, and they were going to have to use that lunar module that you saw Neil and Buzz land in, that wasn't designed for anything except landing on the moon. They were going to have to live in that. Now, that spacecraft was designed for 2 people for 2-3 days to explore the moon. And those 3 people, the whole crew of Apollo 13, we're going to have to cram into it, get all the way back to the moon in about a week. And it was a huge engineering challenge. And the people in mission control scratched their heads. They never gave up. They worked out how to make the oxygen stretch, how to make the electricity stretch, everything that they needed to get home. But they had one big problem that they did not know how to solve. And when you're in space, you're breathing all this oxygen that was in those oxygen tanks. When you breathe in oxygen, we'll breathe it in, out comes carbon dioxide. That's the waste gas that we all get rid of. And if there's too much carbon dioxide in the air, it's bad for humans. We stop being able to not breathe oxygen, we get sleepy, we eventually die. Now, in a spacecraft, you can't just open the window to let all that carbon dioxide out. And so what happens is that we have these things called scrubbers. There are these magic boxes that absorb all the carbon dioxide so that the astronauts can keep breathing it. But in their lunar module that was designed for 2 astronauts for 2 days, they had one sort of scrubber. The one in the command module where they were supposed to be had one that was a different size. And the mission control people had to work out how to make these scrubbers, these magic boxes, fit in the other hole. And what they did was they took all the things that they knew the astronauts had in the spaceship. They worked out a magical way, a really clever way to hook one box up to the other so they could get rid of the air. And they built the device that you can see here in mission control. And this is everyone in mission control saying, we built this, this is going to be the answer to your problems. But they had to explain to the astronauts who couldn't see them how to build it. Now, the astronauts were cold, they were tired, they were hungry, they were trying to get back to Earth. But they followed the instructions that mission control had given them. And the amazing thing was, this was the one they built in space. And it looked exactly the same. And when they were able to plug it in, it got rid of the carbon dioxide and the astronauts made it back to Earth. Now, as they were getting back to Earth, this was the picture they finally took when they had their spacecraft separate. And you can see, just if you look really closely on the side of the spacecraft, how big the explosion was. It ripped out the side of the spacecraft. They were so lucky to be alive, because that explosion really could have gone in all sorts of different directions. It could have damaged the spacecraft. They did so well to make it all the way nearly back to Earth, but they still had to get back all the way through what we call re-entry. They had to get back to the safety of Earth and splash down in the ocean. And they did that. And this was the cheering faces when they landed. Now, if you don't know the story of Apollo 13, you can read it in my book. I have to say there is a great film as well called Apollo 13 that tells all of that story. But it is just amazing to me that for everything that they did, it was all the people in mission control and their ingenuity, using the things they had. There was socks and sellotape and things in that scrubber that allow them to stay alive and get safely back to Earth. So those are some of the stories that you might have heard about going to the moon, but there are lots and lots of other stories in the book. And I wanted to share one that's about two of my favorite women, Sally Ride and Svetlana Savitskaya. Sally's on the left and Svetlana is on the right. And you might have heard of them, but you might not. And they were two of the women who were not the first women to go into space. That was Valentina Tereshkova, but they were the second and the third. And they were flying in space about the same time in the early 1980s. And when they were both selected, Svetlana by the Soviet Union, which was the big country before Russia, and Sally by the Americans, they both had really similar experiences, because when they were selected as astronauts, it was unusual for women to be selected as astronauts. Sally Ride was the first, along with 5 other women, who were selected to be astronauts in 1978. And you can see their class here. It was a big class. There were 35 different astronauts who were chosen to train. There were 35 people who were chosen to train as astronauts. But if you look closely, you can see that there are 6 women in there, and there are just a handful of people as well who aren't white. So it was a great big deal, because it was the first time that NASA weren't hiring white male military test pilots. It was great. They were showing that finally people were realizing that different people could be astronauts. Now, after this photograph was taken, the only people that the news people wanted to talk to, the media people wanted to talk to, was Sally and her other counterparts. And all they wanted to talk about was the women. They didn't ask them all the questions they were asking the men about, you know, are you excited to be going to space? Are you going to be a good astronaut? These things. They asked them questions they were never going to ask the men. How are you going to do your hair? Are you going to cry in space? Lots of questions just because they were women. And what Sally went through all of this, and over in the Soviet Union, so did Svetlana. So Svetlana, when she first went into space, she got into space and was greeted by her 2 cosmonauts with an apron and told to go and find the kitchen. So they both had to deal with all sorts of silly nonsense just because they were women. But they were both exceptional astronauts on exceptional missions, breaking the boundaries. Now, the story I wanted to share about you was how they met, and they only met once in their life. After Sally's mission, she went on a big tour. She went to tell lots and lots of people what was going on with her mission. And one day she was at a big space conference in Hungary. Now, she'd been told to go meet lots of people and to tell her all about her mission, but the big rule she had was you must not talk to the people from the Soviet Union, because the US and the Soviet Union were having some difficult relationships. Politically, it was very difficult, and Sally had been told, don't want to talk to anyone because we don't want to make anything even worse. So she was in this conference. She was in a room with lots and lots of people, and suddenly there was a tap on her shoulder. She turned around and she saw Svetlana standing there, and she beamed, she smiled. Sally knew all about Svetlana, and Svetlana knew all about Sally, and they were really 2 of the only people in the whole world who knew what they had been going through as female astronauts back in the 1980s. Sally desperately wanted to talk to Svetlana, but she remembered her orders really quickly. She made her excuses, she panicked, and she made her excuses, and she disappeared off to the other side of the room. But afterwards, she felt sad. She said, oh, yes, I really would have liked to talk to Svetlana. And she felt really bad that she'd run away. So she said to her Hungarian translator, she said, I'd like to see more of Svetlana. I was sorry that I didn't do that. And her Hungarian translator said, all right, leave it with me. And later that day, Thomas, her Hungarian translator, said, Sally, I've got you an invite to a party at Bertalan's house. Bertalan was the Hungarian astronaut. And with a little wink, he said, other people are going to be there. And Sally, they go, oh God, what should I do? She understood what they meant, but she was really worried. She wanted to go and meet Svetlana, but she'd been told not to. She thought about it. She thought about it. She said, "No, I'm going to go." So later that evening, a big black limousine came, big car, picked her up. She got in it. She was taken through the streets of Budapest. The rain was hammering down on the car. It was a wet, dark evening. And then the car suddenly pulled up behind the sort of a door in the back street, and it opened. She went, "What am I doing?" She felt like she was in a spy movie. What happens? Is this a trap? Is someone to get me? She carried on. She walked up the stairs. The door opened and she went into Bertalan's apartment, and she immediately relaxed, because there in the middle of Budapest, she was in a flat that looked just like the flat of hers or her other friend. There were lots of space pictures on the wall. It looked just like a normal place, and everybody was smiling. And a few minutes later, Svetlana arrived and turned up. And Sally and Svetlana had the most wonderful evening together, sharing stories, sharing their experiences of what it had been like to be a female astronaut, putting up with all the silly questions from the media. They had a fabulous evening. They exchanged gifts, they smiled, and at the end of the evening, they went back. And they never met again. That was the only day that Sally and Svetlana ever met. They tried to stay in touch, and they certainly both remembered that day very fondly. And today we can remember Sally and Svetlana and their contributions. And fortunately today we live in a world where, everybody can go to space, and there's no difference between male and female astronauts. And the media are slowly just about learning not to ask silly questions. But I love the story that they did just meet that once and could share those stories. And when Svetlana went into space, she went here to the Mir space station. You might have heard of the International Space Station. But before that, this was Mir. This was the Russian space station. It was a beautiful, beautiful space station in the sky, the first one. One day, not when Svetlana was there, there was another crew on board with Vasily and Sasha and Mike. And this is a story that's in the book. And the way that they would live on the Mir space station for months at a time. And they had to get, of course, all their supplies come up from Earth. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see down at the bottom, there's a spacecraft there. And that is the Progress spacecraft that brings all the cargo to and from the Mir space station. And one day when Vasily and Sasha and Mike were there was a Progress arriving to bring all their supplies for them. And the crew had been told that to try and save money, they were going to have to dock this cargo spaceship themselves. Normally, they come up, there's no astronauts in them, no cosmonauts, but they are controlled by computer, and there's an automatic docking. It's all done by computer, by remote control. But they were trying to save money. They said, no, you can do this. You can basically be like a video game. You can look at a computer screen and you can see the spacecraft coming towards you, and you're going to be able to control it and dock it in. And Vasily, the commander, was a bit not sure about this, but these were his orders and this is what he did. And the Progress was coming up and up and he was controlling it. It was really hard to see. And all of a sudden he went, "Whoa, look out." And he knew it was too late. And the Progress smashed into the side of the Mir space station, causing all sorts of damage. And immediately, as soon as it crashed in, the alarm started ringing, the pressure dropped in their ears. You know, when you go into an aeroplane, sometimes you can feel the pressure change in your ears. The cosmonauts and the astronauts felt the pressure change in the spacecraft because the air was rushing out the side of the spacecraft. Everything got plunged into darkness. That was it. That was really, really bad. They knew that it was a big problem. So Michael Foale and Vasily and Sasha rushed to their Soyuz spacecraft, their emergency home. They made sure they could get home. But having made sure they could get home, they wanted to try and save Mir. Mir was the pride and joy of Russia and wanted to see if it was all right. And so they tried to go and work out where all the air was rushing out. And they worked out, could see it, and they knew that they had to isolate a particular module. They had to shut the hatch to one of the parts of the space station. And so that's what they were trying to do. Michael and Sasha were doing that, but the hatch that they had to shut was covered in wires. There were lots and lots of things going through it. And so all these cables were there, the air was rushing out, and they couldn't get the door in until these wires were going to close. And that was when Sasha grabbed a knife and he started hacking away at those wires to try and see if they were going to get out of the way. But then there were sparks flying. Now, sparks in space might lead to a fire. And if they had a fire on top of the air rushing out and everything was tumbling all over the place, that would be bad. So Sasha had to dive into the pitch blackness, try and find the end parts, and eventually pull them out, appear triumphant, and shut the door. And that was it. The air stopped rushing out. But still, the space station was tumbling over and over and over again. And Michael Foale, who was born in Cambridge, but he was flying as a NASA astronaut, he was like, he had to work out what they were going to do. So the space station was tumbling over and over and over, and unless they could stop it and get it in the right way to start capturing the sun's energy, they were going to have to abandon it and go home. And so what Michael did was he looked out at the stars, and he had studied astronomy. He knew that night sky, and he looked out and he looked to see where the stars were, and he held out his thumb. He just used his thumb. He held out his thumb, and he looked to see how they were moving, and he go, I can see how we're moving, and I know that we need to just nudge the space station by firing the thrusters just this little bit. And he told mission control what to do, and he did it by using his thumb, and slowly and surely they brought the Mir space station to a standstill, and then they were able to repoint it and get to see the solar arrays. And that was how Mike Foale managed to save the Mir space station, just by looking at his thumb. They slowly got it back to life, and they got the solar arrays pointing at the sun, and then everything started moving, and they brought Mir back to life, and it was beautiful. They managed to keep the Mir space station going for quite a little bit longer, until it was going to be replaced by the International Space Station. Now, Mir isn't up in space anymore, even though it continued. And so what happened to it when it finished, when it got to the end? Well, it had to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. So long after Michael and Sasha and Vasily had saved it, and when everybody had left and gone home, they fired the engines again one more time to slow it down, to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, and it burned up in the Earth's atmosphere, just like a giant shooting star. And this was, you could see it re-enter. These were the images of it re-entering. And the reason you could see it was that it was so big that not everything disintegrated and what went burned up and turned into fireballs on the way back. Some of the chunks were so big they survived that firing re-entry, and they landed in the Pacific Ocean. So now that beautiful space station that Svetlana went to, that Michael went to, that Vasily went to, some of it is swimming with the fish down in the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. So this is probably the space station that you all know today. This is the International Space Station. And the stories that are on the International Space Station today are just as fantastic as all the ones that had happened in the past. And I just wanted to share a little story with you, and that happened with Sunny and Yuri and Aki here when they were on the space station. They had to fix a bit of the space station. And this is Sunny, who had been out training for a spacewalk to fix a bit of the space station called the Main Bus Switching Unit, the MBSU, which you can see behind her. It was a big white box, very important box that's part of the electricity system on the space station. And it had broken. There was still lots of electricity going through it, but the flight controllers down in mission control couldn't control this thing, and they couldn't do what it needed to do. And so Sunny and Aki had trained to replace this box and get the space station back to normal. And they trained for a year for it. And this was the big day. They got the old box out. They put the new one in. Aki had the screwdriver. There were 2 bolts that needed to be screwed in. It was all back to normal, and they could carry on. Sunny did the first one all the way in. Second one. Keep going, keep going, keep going, and it stopped 1 centimeter from the bottom. This was bad, because that bolt had to be all the way into the bottom in order for the space station to be fixed. And it got stuck. Mission Control asked them to try it again and again. Hours and hours they kept trying this bolt to go in and they couldn't do it. And then Sunny and Aki had to go back inside because it was time for them to go back inside to the safety of inside the space station. Now, they'd made the situation worse. This is what you never do in space. Before they went out on their spacewalk, the box was working, they just couldn't control it. Now, they'd removed the broken one and they'd put a new one in place that wasn't working. And so the space station didn't have enough power. If things were going to go worse, it was going to be a really bad day in space because there'd be no power or not lots of power for the experiments. And we'd end up just like Mir, being really bad and out of power and all sorts of bad day. So Sunny and Aki had a week before they were going to go out and try and fix the space station again. And so Mission Control got to work and had to go, oh, why isn't this working? And they worked out, well, why is the bolt not working? They had to solve the problem. They solved it by going all the way back to the beginning of the problem. And Mission Control went and found the people who had designed this box and this bolt. And went, well, what's the problem? And then they went and talked to the people who had installed this box on the space station originally. And that was where they found out that these bolts could be a bit tricksy and you had to kind of jiggle things up and down and it had been a bit stiff. And they worked out what had happened, but they worked out that they'd now made so much mess trying to get this bolt in and out that they were going to have to clean it. And what were they going to have to clean all of these metal shavings out the hole with? And they realized that what they needed was some sort of brush. Now, where do you find a brush from in space? A toothbrush. And that was how a toothbrush became the thing that fixed the International Space Station. Mission Control put together a toothbrush. You can see on the right, they put together another brush, a wire cleaning brush. They figured it out. They sent Sunny and Aki back out a week later. They used the toothbrush tool to fix the bolt, and they were able to fix the space station the way they planned to a year ago. But my favorite bit of this story is that after they'd done all of this, that the managers in the space station went, oh dear, this was really bad. This was a really, really bad thing. We want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So we better make a tool. We need something better than a toothbrush. We better make a special tool just in case this happens again. They did all the research. They worked it all out. They drew all the plans up. And they worked out that it was going to cost hundreds of millions of pounds to design and make a special tool. And so they now keep using toothbrushes. And every time everyone goes out on a spacewalk to do the same sort of thing with the repair, they take a toothbrush. So you in your house have an actual space tool that you use every night for cleaning your teeth, just like the astronauts do. And there's one more thing I think I'm going to tell you about, which was just one more spacewalk. Luca, this is Luca Parmitano. He's an Italian astronaut. He went out on a spacewalk also to fix some bits of the space station. But he ended up having a really bad problem. The spacewalk was going fine. He was loving it. It was his second spacewalk. But about an hour in, he started feeling a really wet patch on the back of his head. And his heart said, well, oh, this is bad. Water's bad. That's not good. He told Mission Control, said, Mission Control, I've got some water back of my head, and said, okay, it's probably just your drinks bag. When you go out on a spacewalk, you have to go out and stay out there for 8 hours at a time with no food. The only thing you have is a bag that's inside your spacesuit with a straw. And Mission Control were convinced that this was the problem. So they said, can you drink all your liquid up? And they did that. But Luca was like, really not sure about this. And slowly but surely, things were getting worse, and there was more and more water. And he said to Mission Control, yeah, this is not good. And they said, all right. They finally said, okay, it's time for you to get back to the space station. So Lucas started leaving all the work behind and started going back to the airlock to where he'd come out of the space station. But as he went back, the water got worse and more water filled his helmet, and it started sticking to the outside, and it got in his ears. And then the sun went down, The space station was behind the Earth, and you couldn't see, and it was in pitch black. And all of a sudden, Luca couldn't see anything. He didn't know which way was up, didn't know which way was down. He couldn't talk to mission control because everything, all the water was in his ears. His radio had stopped working. He was all alone. And he started to get a little bit worried at this point because, you know, if he couldn't get back to the airlock, he was going to die. He was going to drown in his spacesuit. But Luca was an astronaut. And Luca, you know, started thinking, what can I do? How can I get back? And then he remembered that when you do a spacewalk, you always have a tether that connects you all the way back to where you came from. And if you ever have read the story Hansel and Gretel, you know, they led a breadcrumb trail back to their house so they could always follow their way home. And Luca realized if he concentrated really hard, he could just feel the tug on this cable. It's like a big elastic cable that would wind up. And that would guide him home. So just by concentrating and feeling the tug on this cable and blindly feeling his way back, he made it all the way back to the airlock. And this was a photograph of Chris Cassidy, who was out there with him. At this point, the rest of the crew were really worried because they couldn't talk to Luca. They didn't know where he was. Chris, who was with him, was rushing back to the airlock. They got back in the airlock. Everyone was getting really worried. Chris squeezed Luca's hands to sort of say, are you all right? And Luca managed to go, oh, yeah, I'm okay. But still inside, they were out in space and the water kept coming into Luca's helmet and it got worse and worse and worse. He knew he was in the airlock, and once they'd shut the hatch that you can see there, he knew that if he really, really had to, he could whip the helmet off and he'd be able to breathe air. He'd pass out because the air would be really thin because it would still be rushing back in as they got ready to go back into the space station, but he'd be all right. That's what astronauts think about. They got the air back in. The crew got the helmet off Luca's head, and they, you know, he could breathe the air. He wasn't going to drown in space. They said it was great to see you back, but Luca couldn't hear because he still had water in his ear. This was what had happened in the end. You can see the water in the helmet. It turned out that there had been a problem in the suit, and that Luca, when he said it wasn't the drinks bag, he was right. It was the 100 meters of pipe that they wear. There's a water cooling system under the spacesuits to keep the astronauts cool as they're doing their spacewalk, and that had broken. And you know, Luca really nearly drowned in space. We learned from that. We always do whenever something goes wrong in space. And now, whenever someone goes out there, there are they basically have lots of sort of napkins at the back of their helmet, and if any water is in there, they go straight back into the space station. But Luca nearly drowned in space. Now, I said all of those stories in the book, they're real. Even Luca drowning, I have not made any of those up, no matter how unbelievable they seem. But the very last one in the book, I used a little bit of imagination because it's about Mars. And it's about humans going to Mars. And one day, humans are going to Mars. And the very last books, the very last pictures starts, very last story starts imagining what's it going to be like when humans go to Mars. And the really exciting thing is that that could be you. I wanted to put that story in the book because it's coming. We're getting ready to do it. And we really are now. It's a very exciting time. This is a picture from Mars. This is a picture of the Perseverance rover that landed on Mars just a few months ago, and it's now driving around collecting rocks that have come back to Earth in about 10 years' time, when they're going to be studied by scientists. And all of this is getting ready for us to one day send humans to Mars. And so that final story about what it might be like to launch and go to Mars, well, that could be you. This is a picture of sunset on Mars. It was taken by another Mars rover, by Spirit, all the way back in 2005. But I think it's one of the most beautiful pictures from Mars. And one day in your lifetime, you could be writing the next chapters in this book, and you could be going to Mars. You could be maybe part of the team in mission control, helping solve all those problems. You might be the scientists who are getting ready to look at the rocks when they come back. You could be all of those things or any of those things. But what I can tell you is that it's coming, and it definitely could be you. And I hope when you read the stories in the book that you remember that they were all true, and that there's going to be more chapters, and that you could be a part of it. Thank you very much.
A virtual round of applause for our speaker this afternoon, Libby Jackson. Thank you so much. You said right at the start, Libby, that you do not remember the first moon landings. I wish you hadn't said that, because it instantly reminded me that a small boy who was about 8 years old at the time, was woken up and came downstairs in his pajamas to sit in front of a black and white television set to actually watch the first moon landing, and that was me. Can I just say, in the unlikely instance that a man who is now nearly 60 ends up in space, could you please be part of the ground control team? Because I think I'd find your voice most reassuring and calming when something went wrong, and I'd be looking for a felt tip pen or maybe a toothbrush. We've got quite a number of questions, and if, having heard what Libby's had to say so far, you want to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to post your questions for Libby, then please do. We have quite a number of them already. The first one that came from Alexis and Grayson, and the question is a very simple one. Why do all the ships, the spaceships, start with Apollo?
That's a wonderful story, a wonderful question. And hello, Alexis and Grayson. They don't actually all start with Apollo, and it may be a lot of people start there because it's the famous ones. It's the ones we know about. It was the most exciting thing about walking on the moon. No one had done it before, and I started there because I think that's what a lot of people know about. But it's not the first story in the book. Absolutely not. It goes all the way back to the very first human in space, who was called Yuri Gagarin, and his mission. And even before that, goes back to the first satellites in space. And there's a great story in there, which you're going to have to go and read. But right back at the beginning of this space race, when America and the Soviet Union were trying to prove that they were the biggest and the best country by getting the best things into space, they were really competing with each other. That they started with trying to launch satellites. And the first satellite in space was called Sputnik. And that was launched by the Soviet Union. The very first American satellite in space was called Explorer 1. Now that was launched into space on a rocket, and the rocket was designed by someone called Wernher von Braun. But one of the things I love is that it would not have got into space unless a chemist called Mary Sherman Morgan invented a new fuel to get into it. And no one knows about Mary Sherman Morgan. Her name's really not often talked about in space stories, but if it wasn't for her, America wouldn't have got their first satellite into space. And so that's one of the stories in the book. There's lots and lots of them, but we always start with Apollo, I think, just because everyone likes the moon.
Do we know why the Americans chose Apollo, Libby?
Oh, as a name?
Yeah.
It's a good question. There is yes, it's because of a bit of Greek mythology that I can't remember.
Right,
I'm not
that's okay. It's not a test in Greek mythology.
No. But there was Mercury, and there was Gemini, and there was Apollo, and it's all back to the mythology. The bit I do know is that Apollo was a Greek god, I think. He had a sister, and his sister is called Artemis. And the reason that we've called Artemis, the missions that are going to go back to the moon in the next decade, it's been called Artemis because Artemis was Apollo's sister. And I think it's really nice that Apollo and Artemis look like that.
That's very appropriate. An anonymous attendee asks, in the Apollo mission, and I think this question came up when you showed the photograph, who was taking the photographs and why in mission control when they were frantically trying to fix the spacecraft?
They've always been taking lots of pictures in mission control. I think it's great. NASA and the European Space Agency now and others are very good at documenting what's going on. And so they were just taking the photographs to make sure that we had a record of what was happening. On the moon, the picture I showed you on the moon, that was Neil Armstrong on the moon, and that was taken by Buzz Aldrin. So they didn't have sort of tripods or selfie sticks or anything like that. But to me, it's one of the greatest treasure troves out there. All these pictures that are taken by NASA, by the European Space Agency, they're all out there, and they're thousands and thousands of them, and you can go and see them for free, and they're beautiful.
Can I interject one of my own questions here? We'll come to more of our guest questions. Approximately, how many people on the ground does it take to put one person into space? Has anybody ever worked out the ratio, people on Earth to getting one man or woman in space?
Thousands and thousands and thousands. It's so
Right.
many. And it's one of the things that I hope people learn in the book, and just from listening to me talking, it takes so many people in lots of different jobs. So we always know about the astronauts. They're the people at the top that we're there, but you have the people in mission control. You've got the people who design the spacecraft. You've got the doctors who are looking after the astronauts. You've got the communications people who are doing all the video and the tweeting and so on. You've got lawyers, you've got accountants, you've got people who are
they're everywhere. They're everywhere.
If you want to work in the space industry, get involved, there are jobs, because we have every which way. So there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And of course, it's not just the astronauts. We all rely on satellites every single day to do everything. And we've all got to put those satellites in space as well. So there's lots and lots of people to do.
Quick question from Arthur. What's the difference between a cosmonaut and an astronaut?
Great question. Nothing. It just depends on really where you come from. The Russian word is cosmonaut. The American word is astronaut. The Chinese word for someone who goes into space is taikonaut. They're all just people who go into space. And whether it's astronaut or cosmonaut just really depends on whether you came from America or Europe or the Soviet Union or Russia.
All right. We love your expertise. And obviously, as we've seen in the shots at the start, you know folks like Tim Peake, and you've been intimately involved with lots of space missions. You haven't been into space yourself, but Rosie asks, would you ever take a tourist flight into space if one became available to you?
I'd love to go, Rosie. Yes, thank you. Have you got one that I can have, please, if anyone wants to send me?
We're going to have a whip round, everybody.
There's a quick plug, actually, because if you're really quick, you've still got 10 days to apply to the European Space Agency to be an astronaut. For some of the younger listeners out there, that might be a bit much. The younger people, in fact, all of us, if you start saving now, you can buy a ticket and go into space in your lifetime, and that's coming. And I've been lucky enough to not go all the way to space, but I have floated like an astronaut. I've been in a plane that flies in what are called parabolas. It flies over and over, a bit like a roller coaster. And it's the same thing that would happen if you imagine a football with a little ball inside it and you kick it. And if you looked at like the little ping pong ball inside it, you'd see it would float inside the football as it went over. And that's what happened to me inside the plane. And I got to float, and it was so much fun. I'd love to go to space.
Okay, if you have a question for Libby, please post it now in the Q&A section, because we haven't got much longer. We do have to finish on time. So if you have an urgent question, please do ask it now. Dill says in our question and answer section, how long do astronauts have to train before they go into space, Libby?
That's a great question, Dill. Hi, Dill. Years and years and years. It takes 2 years just to qualify from being chosen to be an astronaut to sort of being ready to go into space. And then you've normally got another 18 months or 2 years. So it can take 4 or 5 years to get ready for a sort of long, proper 6-month mission. Long time. Lots to learn.
Okay. Can I ask you a question? What are astronauts allowed to take into space? For example, the men and women who go up to the ISS, the International Space Station, you know, are you told that you can take 50 grams, a kilo of your own stuff, of photographs or of, I don't know, music CDs or whatever it is you might want to travel with that's personal to you?
They do. They get about a shoebox. You get less luggage than you do, you know, if you have to get on carry-on on a budget aeroplane and go somewhere. And they pack into that things like photographs, mementos that they would like to take into space. Separate to that, they also get to choose food. which I think is really exciting. So most of their food in space is kind of the same as everybody else's, but every astronaut gets to choose some food that they want. When Tim Peake went into space, he asked the children of the UK to decide what he should take. Other people like to take their favorite sweets, or, some peanut butter or something like that. So they do get to choose their own food, but it has to be long life. There's not really any ability to have lots of fresh food on the space station. So it's lots of long life food.
Leave broccoli down on Earth. I'm sure we'll all be happy about it. No, we won't. I love broccoli. D68 says, why was the first animal in space a dog?
Oh, well, let me think about this. So some would say the first animal in space wasn't a dog, because I think even before that they'd sent fruit flies into space, amazingly. But the dog that you're talking about is called Laika, and she was really the sort of first mammal in space, that say, other than the fruit flies and this sort of thing. And the Soviet Union sent her into space because no one knew, if you floated in space, if animals, humans, anything could survive. We didn't understand. Would the heart stop working? Would you be sick? Would you not be able to breathe? And so they chose a dog, just I think because they felt that they could put them well in a spacecraft, and that was how they did. So Laika was the very first sort of big animal in space, and she didn't come back. She died in space, which was really sad. But she paved the way.
That was the supplementary I was going to leave off asking you. Ewan, Reese and Sky ask, what thing do you have to learn to go into space? I mean, you said a few minutes ago, putting people into space involves obviously scientists, but it involves lawyers, mathematicians. But is there one subject that Ewan, Reese and or Sky could aim at studying that you think is a real good entree to becoming an astronaut? It
would be a science subject or a math subject, engineering, something like that. The astronauts that the European Space Agency are looking for at the minute, they don't have to have many qualifications, because astronauts come from all sorts of different places, but they do have to have a master's degree in a science or a technical or an engineering math subject, or be a test pilot. So science and technology are really good. They'll get you into all sorts of different space careers as well. But as I said, you don't have to do that to come and work in the space industry either. So the best advice is always to do the things that you like doing, because you'll do them well. And everybody, all the astronauts are always really good at doing the things they do before.
Okay. As someone whose name I cannot pronounce, and I apologize for this, Vaibav Barde says, what are your thoughts and ideas on space travel and expectations? I mean, we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier on with the race of the Elon Musks, the Richard Bransons and the Jeff Bezoses all trying to get into space and trying to sort of make space flight available as a commercial thing for the wealthy to do. What are your thoughts and expectations for the next 5, 10, 20 years? Will going into space become a common thing for those who can afford the ticket?
Yeah, I think it will. It's a really, really exciting time for all of us, because we are building things now to send humans back to the moon. So I didn't see the Apollo landings, but I am going to see people walk on the moon, and we're going to see them all in high definition, 4K, modern technology. I'm so excited when we get the first tweet from the moon or something. So that's coming. We're seeing all this space tourism open. At the minute, you've got to have really, really deep pockets. If you want to go and buy a ticket to get to the space station, you've got $40 million or something. But you can go to space and just sort of for a few minutes for $200,000, and that's a lot of money. But that's going to come down. It will get more common. We will see it. You think right back to the days when aeroplane travel was just for the rich and famous, and now hopefully in times when we can all meet again, we'll hop back over to Europe on our budget airlines with our check-in suitcase. And space travel is really, really exciting. We will see humans land on Mars in the next 20-ish years, I think.
Don't expect to be allowed to fly if you've got any sign that you might be having the measles. Always take a felt tip pen with you. Remember, your toothbrush is not just for brushing your teeth, it might save your life. Libby, I can't begin to thank you enough for sharing your enthusiasm and your expertise as part of this first day of the Great York Festival of Ideas talks today. It's been absolutely splendid that you've shared all the things you have. Thank you so much indeed. Remind people about your book again, please.
Oh, thank you. It's called Space Explorers. It's out now in hardback. It's coming in paperback in September. In all good bookshops. 25 stories, beautiful illustrations. Thank you, York Festival Ideas, for having me. Thank you, Jonathan, for chairing us so beautifully. And thank you to everybody out there for tuning in. I wish I could see you. It's just lovely to know you're out there.
Okay, if you'd like to purchase a copy of Libby's book, by the way, Space Explorers is available from the York Festival of Ideas partner bookseller, which is Fox Lane Books. For more information, you need to go to foxlanebooks.co.uk/festival-of-ideas. If you enjoyed this event, you might also be interested in Zizgi Live to Infinity and Beyond, taking place tonight at 8 o'clock. And I'm terribly sorry that I've mispronounced that. The recording of this event is going to be available on the York Ideas YouTube channel. That can be accessed by typing your York Ideas YouTube into Google. However, please allow a couple of days for it to be processed and for it to appear. If you found those references to the early moon missions as spine-tingling from Libby as I did, if you've never heard a BBC series called 13 Minutes to the Moon, my goodness me, those are good listens. They're short, they're only about 12, 15 minutes long. It's a two-part series, multi-part series from BBC Radio, available from the BBC Sounds app. Libby, you're nodding as if you've heard 13 Minutes to the Moon.
Very good.
They make the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Thank you so much indeed, everyone, for tuning in and joining in this webinar, part of the York Festival of Ideas, the 10th of its ilk. This is day one, so you've been in at the start. And thank you again to Libby Jackson for being such a great speaker and such a wonderful guest for us this afternoon. Thank you for joining, and that brings this session to an end. Goodbye.